Good morning. My name's Alastair and Tim. I'm the Chief Strategy Officer at CyberCX. Welcome to another edition of CyberCX's Cyber Dialogue. That's hard to say, Tim, where I speak with high-profile Australians, and overseas people, who are in the political, bureaucratic and business class of Australia. Today we're joined by one of Australia's most vocal, and I'm going to say loudly spoken, albeit he's a very softly spoken man, cyber leader, and his career has spanned both the public and private sector. It's Tim Watts, the federal member for Gellibrand and the opposition cyber security minister, I'm going to say, the shadow cyber security minister. He can correct me on all of these things when we speak. His career has included being a senior manager at Telstra and a lawyer at Mallisons. Tim, good morning.
It's a pleasure to be with you, Alastair. Long-time viewer, first-time guest.
Great. Well, I butchered the opening, so you can correct me on any facts if we have. All good?
All good. You know, as a politician, I take vocal and loud as compliments.
Well, exactly, and yet you're a very softly spoken and very considered person on these matters of cybersecurity, and it is a great opportunity to have you here today. I'm going to start, if I could, talking about the paper that you released in February this year, Beyond the Blame Game. A couple of key recommendations in there. Could you run through them and we'll pick them apart?
Sure. So I got the cybersecurity portfolio in the opposition after the 2019 election, and like anyone in the InfoSec space, I'd seen the way that ransomware has been escalating in that time, increasing frequency, but also increasing scale of attacks. So we came to the view in the opposition that it was really time that we have a dedicated strategy to coordinate government action in response to this issue. So we thought that the increasing sophistication of these actors wasn't just a threat and a challenge, but also presented a little bit of an opportunity, because we thought if we can get into the ROI calculations of these ransomware crews, if we can increase targeting Australian organisations, if we can decrease the returns of successfully targeting Australian organisations, maybe we could affect their target selection calculus and encourage them to look for targets elsewhere. So in that discussion paper, we outlined across government, across policy, law enforcement, diplomacy, even sort of more direct intelligence community type operations, what are the levers available to government to increase costs and reduce returns? But really the core objective here for us is to say to government, like, look, this is getting a little bit beyond a joke. The trajectory of ransomware in our economy and our impacting our nation is unsustainable. And organisational security, asking organisations to lift their cyber resilience to protect against that, absolutely. That's the first part of this, of responding to ransomware, but it's not the end of the conversation. Government and other actors have a very significant role to play here too.
Great. A few things. One, I should say to our audience, feel free to send questions in. We'll probably have about 10 minutes at the end, and we'll pick through those and ask you some. It'll be largely unfiltered, Tim, so get ready. It is the internet after all, and we know how pleasant people can be there. But
that's an occupational hazard for me, Mac.
Well, that's right, on the internet and a politician, which is great. So we were talking before we went on air that this is like trying to become the second slowest gazelle. I often say that you don't have to outrun the bear, you've just got to outrun the other people that are running from the bear, the same analogy. Tell me how or what some of the things you're proposing that could drive cost. I see it as driving cost into the operations of the criminals. What are some of the things you're proposing?
So on the cost side of the ledger, there are a few things that we can do. Mm-hmm. So there's been an increasing debate over time about getting signals agencies, getting the intelligence community involved here, and directing offensive operations against these criminal enterprises. The former Defence Minister has said that ASD is already involved a little bit in that in Australia, that they're willing to go after criminal entities. However, there's very little detail about what, in a practical sense, they're doing and what circumstances that would happen in. I was pretty persuaded by a piece that Kieran Martin, the former NCSC director, put on Lawfare earlier this year. He says you can talk about imposing costs in a theoretical sense, but unless you've got specifics and you can point to what you're actually doing, it sort of becomes an empty political slogan. So what we've proposed in the paper is that a bit of a mindset change within these agencies, and let's be a little bit more explicit. What are the circumstances that we will get involved in this way? What will we actually do, and who will we go after? So, in other crime types, we've been known to take out billboards saying, don't do this, or Australia will do this. That's the kind of world we want to get into. Another significant part of imposing cost, I think, is on the law enforcement side of the equation. So, frankly, in this space, we're living in a bit of an age of impunity. There is what some of the policy experts talk about a cyber enforcement gap between, the extraordinarily large volume of crime in this space and the very small number of enforcement actions. We really want it to be a law enforcement priority in Australia. We've seen some of that in the US in recent times, where a task force has been stood up within the Department of Justice and the FBI to direct resources, to direct manpower towards this issue. We've seen the Homeland Security Director make the point that this is a national security issue, and they're clearly gearing up to go after these crews. We want that happening in Australia, but we're not set up to do that yet. And I'm happy to go into more detail about that later.
Of course, well, let's do that. So I'm going to ask you, yes or no, is law enforcement doing enough?
Not doing enough. We've got some great talent within our law enforcement agencies, and I have enormous admiration for them. But if you look at the institutional arrangements in Australia, the current setup is, the AFP have told us in Senate estimates that in response to ransomware, they'll get involved if it's an incident involving a Commonwealth entity, involving critical infrastructure, systems of national significance, or if it's an incident of the scale of affecting the national economy.
Did they say how many of those investigations they've conducted?
They wouldn't say how many investigations they've conducted, but they said that they've made one charge in the last 12 months. And this is a 12-month period where we've seen very significant incidents affecting hospitals in both Victoria and Queensland. Seen the attack on the Nine network, seen an attack on the New South Wales Labor Party, seen attacks on groups like Lion, Toll, BlueScope. And
the list goes on, right?
List goes on.
A day doesn't go by now without, frankly, a serious ransomware incident.
Well, you listen to any of the InfoSec podcasts now, and there's almost a segment, this week in ransomware attacks, where they just sort of go through them all. And that kind of impunity, I think, has emboldened these groups.
So would the police defence in this be the operators are offshore? And if they are, what should they be doing for offshore criminality?
100%. That is part of the issue here, right? It requires international coordination in order to do this. But I think we should be ambitious in this respect. We should want to be a part of those international posses that are going after these crews. When you look at the Netwalker takedown, the really significant coordinated action against Emotet, you look at the press releases coming out of those actions.
Laundry list of countries.
You've got Bulgarian law enforcement on there. Australian law enforcement isn't listed on that. Now, I've spoken to Australian law enforcement. They say, we're involved. The extent to which they are involved, I'm not sure. That's not clear to me. It hasn't been revealed to me. But more to the point, I want us to be at the top of that press release. I want us to be able to send a signal to these groups saying, you know what, if you come after Australian organisations, we're going to keep chasing you. This is going to be a pain for you. We're going to put cost into your business model. So
when I first joined the Australian Federal Police, and I too, by the way, the AFP and other policing agencies know how much I genuinely care about them, but I'm critical of them in this space. So I'm with you. I often think it's not dissimilar to trying to disrupt the international drug trade, where police post people to the countries that are either transit countries or the nations that are the source of these drugs. And they're tough operating environments. But police, Australian police and others, post staff there in order to start creating, you talk about throwing sand in the gears of the criminal enterprises. You're not trying to get rid of them necessarily, you're just trying to make it harder for them.
I think this is an issue that characterises the way that the InfoSec community thinks about these issues too much, and that there's a bit of a tendency to say, well, that intervention won't solve all the problems, therefore we shouldn't do it. It's not a silver bullet that will end the problem, therefore it's not worth doing. The point I make is we need a full court press across all of the levers that we can pull,
right. Yep.
To put as much cost as possible in, and then maybe over time we'll move the needle.
So I reckon you could use that argument across all the cybersecurity bits, which is what I think you were just saying. To everyone in the industry out there, how many times have you gone to a conference where someone tries to proffer something that will just move us forward, and it's like, no, that won't work. There's the edge case, and it's like, well, unlike every other social issue that we deal with, where you accept things that inch you towards where you're trying to get to. Cybersecurity is one of those things. So we've got to break that, I suspect, in order to get that. You wouldn't want to be called dark side this week after the Colonial Pipeline, isn't it? You know, I'm sure in the podcast you listened to, it was Ransomware of the Week was going to be Colonial Pipeline. Can we talk a bit, in your paper, you talk about these countries that have allowed ransomware groups to operate. I mean, it's the US government was probably slightly more explicit in mid-April when the Treasury, during the SolarWinds attribution, saying that was the FSB. But I thought the more interesting paragraph in that document related to the Russian state green lighting ransomware groups. How do you reckon it'd be to be dark side this week in Moscow?
Well, they deserve to be having a very uncomfortable week, given the damage that they've caused. But again, this goes to the need to think about this in a coordinated framework. So one of the levers we talk about is diplomacy. You know, we really need this to be at the top of the agenda of G7 and multilateral organisations and one-on-one meetings. Biden's meeting with Putin later this year, and you can guarantee this will be a very high-profile issue for them. Because you look at where these actors come from, and it's not just DarkSide. Rebel Evil Corp is probably the best example of this, which was explicitly referred to in some of the US indictments that's come out recently. The bloke that purportedly runs that group, Maxim Yakubuts, drives a fluoro-coloured camouflage Lamborghini with a license plate that translates into thief through the streets of Moscow. Now, you don't need to be an intelligence officer to think that he might have some state cover there, right?
That's right.
So we need, at the leadership level of governments to say, look, you've got to clean up your act and pressure to be brought to bear into that. I think we could also explore some of the more innovative tools of international leverage as well. I mean, we're now seeing what Magnitsky sanctions can do in the human rights space by targeting individuals directly within these systems. I think that's worth exploring in this space. So not only going after individuals within these groups, but also going after people in the law enforcement and the judicial establishment that are enabling them. So if you get a law enforcement or a legal cooperation request from another country, it hits your desk as the AFP equivalent in Moscow, and you don't action it, well, okay, well, the international community might have something to say about that.
Yep. So it's essentially using lots of levers. You mentioned the concept of our international diplomacy. Australia was one of the first countries to actually have an ambassador for cyber affairs in the form of Toby Feakin. How do you reckon that role is going? What more would you want to see? Hi, Toby, if you're out there, by the way. I mean, we both know Toby well, I'm sure. How can a middle power like Australia bring to bear some of those things that you'd normally leave to a superpower?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think Toby and the cyber division inside DFAT, which is a very significant division, a lot of resources has been allocated to that, have done an outstanding job in that space of developing norms of appropriate state behaviour in cyberspace. So, what is it okay for a state to do and what is it not okay? That theoretical level of international law, they've been really outstanding at. Where I think we probably need to allocate more resources, and we discussed this in the discussion paper, is at that kind of harder-edged legal cooperation. Yeah, the so what bit. How are we setting up international arrangements to really operationalise law enforcement in this cyberspace? We do bits and pieces in this space, like expanding nation-state signatories to the Budapest Convention is one of the objectives, and Tonga has signed up. That's great.
Win.
Yep. I don't think it really moves the needle on this ransomware issue, though, right? And Australia, we constantly underrate the influence we can have in these forums. Like Australia as a significant power, not a large nation, but I think more than a middle power. When we're creative in these international forums, when we bring solutions, when we bring agendas, when we put people in the same room, we can really shift the needle internationally. You think about things like the Cairns Group, right, on agricultural tariffs in the WTO or in GATT back then. We had an influence far exceeding
our size of the economy, right?
And this is an issue that is affecting everyone in the West. If we said we're going to go to every one of these forums and we're going to bang down the doors on this, you could put together a posse on this international.
So your paper, I'm going to talk about two bits about money. One, you explored the concept of banning ransomware payments or making them illegal, and you talked about cryptocurrency and the need to kind of, I'm going to say better regulate, though that might not be the phrase you'd use. Could you just unpack both of those two bits and why you didn't get to the banning of ransomware payments?
Sure. Well, as you probably are better placed than anyone in Australia to know, Almac, like going after the money is a tried and true way of shutting down cybercrime enterprises. So you can go back to the big spam cruise that Brian Krebs documented so well a decade or so ago, and the way that those were shut down were lots of incremental moves through the credit card transit processing systems, marginalising more and more of these groups. And there's a long list of law enforcement actions against sort of digital currencies like e-gold back in 2007, it's a deep cut. BTC-E in 2017, another very significant crypto exchange that was processing a large part of ransomware payments at that time, shut down with law enforcement action. So I think it's a really significant way of focusing on the money flows. However, I think the best part of my role as a politician in this space is I go out into the community. I go and meet with organisations. I eyeball CISOs. It's like, what's your posture? How are you responding to this? What's your temperature? And when you say, well, why don't we just ban payments?
Yep.
You see, their eyes sort of widen a little bit and they say, well, of course you should never pay, but you really want the option if it was difficult. And, we know from both criminal intelligence and also from interviews with these groups that about 30% of companies still pay. So we thought that banning payments at this point, particularly without that maturity level in organisations to know that that option is no longer there in case of emergency, is a bit much. So what we thought is, well, can we throw sand in the gears? We wanted to look at like a sanctions type arrangement where sanction entity type arrangement where, if you were going to make a payment, you'd need to call the ACSC, let them know and basically get a tick. So like throwing some bureaucracy in there to slow it down, to force people to consider things might be worth exploring. And I can see that you're holding the...
I wasn't bored when you were answering that, by the way, but you prompted me. Let me just read you a stat from the US Ransomware Task Force paper, which I think backs you up, by the way. I wasn't trying to find a stat
excellent paper.
To catch you out, but I do want to talk a bit more about the recommendations of this. But they were saying, they've said, and it's an eminent group of people that are in that task force, right? Several of them are friends and just good quality people. They've said that 80% of all the funds sent to ransomware addresses in 2020 belong to just 199 wallets, which is, to your point, where you can get an exchange that's doing the wrong thing, knock it out. It doesn't stop the crime, but it just makes it harder. 46% of all of the money sent went to just 25 addresses. So why aren't we taking action against those wallets and those things, right?
Yeah, so this is moving on from the kind of banning payments to enforcing essentially anti-money laundering regulations against these exchanges, right? Yeah, well, so those stats come from a report that Chainalysis have done.
You're better read than I am. I'm not sure. You should flip this around. And
that's my job, Al.
I know. I'm going to ask you how it is having a full-time job doing this stuff as a politician, and why there isn't a government equivalent to you anymore. But I'll get to that.
I'm a tragic geek, Al Mac. Like I do this in my spare time. Yep. But that report had the really, I think, useful insight that AML actions are actually easier in a lot of respects in crypto because you have the blockchain.
Yep, because you can see it.
You can see it.
Yep.
And if you have the analysis tools that are sophisticated enough, you can follow it through. And Chainalysis have also shown that it's actually really difficult to obscure transfers even through crypto tumblers and mixers. So, those services that are designed to cover the tracks. It's pretty hard to do, actually. And if you're good enough, you can follow those flows, even when it jumps from exchange to exchange or platform to platform. The problem, of course, is getting these exchanges to comply with the basic sort of tool set of anti-money laundering. So know your customer, transaction reporting, things like that. I was interested to see that Chainalysis research that those high-risk exchanges that it talks about, they aren't all based in Russia. They aren't all based in non-cooperating regimes.
That's right. Tim, I was asking whether or not the reason why we haven't sort of tried to push what I'm going to call standard laws and expectations upon cryptocurrencies, because we kind of think the internet's some special place. And I think that's one, and sorry, I was then giving you my theory, that for a long time, we just saw the internet as being some form of nirvana that was away from any regulatory, it should be kept away from regulatory hands and fingers, and I can understand that. But when it comes to us just not applying standard expectations of money laundering, we end up with cryptocurrencies being the currency of choice for criminals.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think most serious people have now moved away from that kind of cyberpunk libertarian ideal of the early 90s.
I did a while back.
But, you know, clearly we've seen an internet where, you know, Nazis and pedophiles and terrorist financiers can run free, and like there is no democratic constituency in the world that will cop that, right? So I think as a matter of, you know, sovereignty and democratic mandate, you know, the public expect laws to be applied. In this space, I mean, in Australia, you know, we have money laundering legislation that applies to cryptocurrencies and to exchanges. The enforcement is a little bit questionable, I would say. In fact, the ANAO has put on its prospective audits list, so the list of things that they're looking at and sort of considering conducting a performance audit on, AUSTRAC's enforcement of these these AML legislation against crypto groups. So they're clearly looking at it, asking questions. It is interesting, like you see, particularly Americans are very leery about pushing back against crypto because of that. I think they really see this as a innovation race between China and the US, and, you know, China's made a big bet on this, so, you know, we shouldn't really interfere too much. But we are really reaching the end of the runway on that line of thinking. You know, you look at, say, Binance, which is a very big crypto exchange based out of the Canary Islands. You know, the US IRS and some of their other regulatory authorities just announced a significant inquiry into that exchange this year. And on the way out the door, Donald Trump issued a number of executive orders, presidential interventions to ramp up enforcement action in this space. So I think this is an area where we're going to see a lot of activity over the next 12 months. The international body that sets AML type regulation has been consulting on the application of this to crypto exchanges for some time now. I'm told they're going to issue a new guidelines on that in June of this year. And again, I think that's something that you're going to see high up on the agenda of those multilateral international forums where leaders meet.
And it's a good thing in my view. You've prompted me when you're talking about the concept of rule of law going online. I thought I'd just pivot slightly away from cybersecurity to the point you were making before about offenders and extremists able to operate online. So as you know, I was the inaugural e-safety commissioner. At the time, that was pretty novel legislation. You've since seen these large international efforts like the Christchurch call, you know, came from the worst ever export of Australia, ever, and the horrendous events of Christchurch, and the concept of live streaming that attack and then the replaying of it, etc. And the New Zealanders and the French have led the way in sort of pushing for some of those social norms online. Can I just grab your view on how you think that's tracking, where you think the resistance is, and how far we should go in terms of imposing our sort of own national social norms onto an internet?
Yeah, well, I mean, I spoke on the bill establishing the Safety Commissioner as a new MP after the 2013 election. And the point I made at that time was that this isn't an issue that we can see as limited just to children. You know, this is something that really the big victims of this kind of behaviour online are women and minorities who are getting no protection at all, particularly when it's their workplace, if they're journalists, politicians. I mean, I sat next to Anne Ali in the Parliament for one of the terms when I was elected, and she would show me some of the stuff that she gets, and it is just...
And it's horrendous that people think they can behave that way online.
Not pseudonymous, like they use their actual names.
They use their name. This is I often say, even with the group that used to call itself Anonymous, I'd say you can call yourself anonymous, but you aren't. But these people are actually using their real names and saying things that you just wouldn't be allowed to say at a dinner party. You wouldn't be allowed to say it on a street. You certainly wouldn't be able to say it in a newspaper or on television. Yeah. But they think they can do it on the internet. Is there opposition still today, do you think, to the imposing of those, what I'm just calling social norms on the internet? And if so, what happens when because I'm a proponent of it, of course, right, as you can imagine, but when does it start rubbing with other countries? And when those, I guess those countries already impose, I'm answering my own question, which is the worst type of interview you could ever have. Those countries are already imposing their view on their citizens anyway, aren't they, through kind of censoring the internet?
Well, it's interesting, right? You see the contradictions in this space and the holdouts, even in the Australian Parliament. So, there's a significant expansion in the powers, a tidying up of the legal regime around what the E-Safety Commissioner can do in the Online Safety Bill that Paul Fletcher's introduced into Parliament this term.
You supportive?
Broadly, yeah. We're still discussing some amendments with them, but the broad thrust of it, I think that's a good thing. But even within the Parliament, you see, George Christensen has a private members bill that says that social media platforms should be banned from any kind of mediation, right? Like they shouldn't be allowed to kick people off, that they shouldn't be allowed to interfere with politicians. Craig Kelly stood up and tried to refer Facebook to the Parliamentary Privileges Committee during the last sitting because they kicked him off the platform with their justification of sharing medical misinformation about COVID-19. So there are real tensions here. I think the big thing that's changed in this space, though, is that the sort of scales have come off people's eyes about whether the platforms are really just neutral pipelines providing information to people. Like, people now get that actually the way that the algorithms work on these platforms, it's not a straight dice.
No.
They make decisions that are in their own commercial interests about how those platforms operate, what content gets elevated, what content gets amplified, and what content doesn't. And I had a series of conversations, though this won't be news to any of them listening at home. Like, I had a series of conversations with all these platforms in the lead up to Christchurch because I'd had an encounter with some of these extreme right groups myself, and I started looking into those worlds, and I was saying this is really ramping up. Like, there is a radicalisation engine happening here on these social media platforms, drawing people in, and once they're in,
echo chamber, right? That's the
once
trouble,
they're
right?
in, they've taken them in a particular direction that I thought was really dangerous, and we saw the manifestation of that in Christchurch. So I think that's the big difference. People aren't anymore looking at these platforms as neutral conveyors of information or a neutral public space.
Yeah, it is fascinating how far that debate has progressed. If you go back even, I'm going to say 10 years, you'd be almost howled down, as I might have been on a few occasions, saying, I think we're allowing the wrong type of people to be there. And when you say wrong, it sounds like you're being judgmental, and frankly you are, right? I mean, it's not acceptable that someone can be an extremist online, just as it's not offline. So great. Sorry for that little rabbit hole to jump. I'm going to drag you back now to ransomware. And can I just say, one of the reasons for focusing on ransomware isn't just because you put out the paper, which I thought was a really interesting contribution to the discussion. We talked to a lot of boards and C-suite people. I got to say, we've probably spoken to 60 boards in the last 3 months. And the number one question they ask is, tell me about ransomware. What happens if it hits us? Do I pay? If we do pay, how does that impact us? What are the laws around it? There is a crying need for this type of discussion.
So it's really interesting. When I first started consulting with colleagues about the need to get into this space, I had a conversation with the Shadow Treasurer, Jim Chalmers, and the second I said ransomware, he's like, that comes up constantly when I'm meeting with boards.
Yep.
Like, in his day job as the Shadow Treasurer engaging with the business community, he's like, that's a hot issue. Like, we should definitely push into this space. And I think that's really interesting, right? Because the issue has moved from an issue where CISOs are knocking on the doors of boardrooms trying to get directors engaged with this issue, to now CEOs are knocking on the doors of politicians saying, what are you doing about this issue? What are you doing to help us about this? Frankly, job-destroying, investment-killing impost on the Australian economy.
Yep. And potentially, of course, as we know, life-threatening. So we've seen one death in Germany, right? But we all know that if this hit the right type
Look at what's happening in Ireland at the moment.
Yes, exactly. And New Zealand got hit yesterday too.
Oh, I didn't even see that one. You can't even keep up.
And it's right, to your point. I mean, it's look at the impact on hospital systems. Imagine if there was an electricity supplier or generator, or imagine if it was, a traffic light operator or something. I mean, we're talking real life stuff here. And I often refer to it as an existential threat. And I think if it's done in a way that's, and I think only criminals could ever conceive of doing this, unlike nation states. We'll get onto that, the concept of the difference soon.
So on that one, we jumped from banning payments to going after crypto.
Yep.
I think there is a little bit of a middle ground that we need to explore here, and that came from that Institute of Security and Technology report, and they make what I think it should be the basically the price of admission for taking this issue seriously, and that's setting up a mandatory notification scheme.
I was about
for
to
making
say
ransom
that. I mean,
payments.
level playing field, right? I mean, it's a bit like the notifiable data breach regime.
It's the exact
I
same.
was about to raise that as a question. Great. Could you go down that path?
So I mean, the mandatory data breach legislation is about telling individuals that their information's been compromised. I think we need a parallel regime at the moment that says if you're going to make a ransomware payment, we're not going to ban you from doing that, but we are going to require that before you do so, you call the ACSC up, you say, we're going to do this, and we'll give you a standard form that you need to fill out to make a notification of this. And in that standard form, we should be collecting who's the threat actor here? What's the wallet that they're asking you to pay into? What are the indicators of compromise? The vectors? Where are the C2 infrastructure? Actionable threat intel about operations that are underway at that time. Make sure that is available not just to government, but through the system so people can protect themselves from that as well. If you move quickly enough, there's a theoretical possibility that law enforcement could take action against crypto exchanges before money is pulled out of those exchanges as well. That's a world that we should be aiming to get to in terms of the law enforcement response. We're not there yet, but it's a theoretical possibility. But it can only happen if we have this price of entry regulatory regime.
Because at the moment, if we go down the concept of people reporting cybercrime, there's not a lot of incentive for the victim to do that, right? Yeah. I'd argue that you can't conceal a serious offence and that you've got to notify law enforcement, etc. And for some reason, people think that because it happens online, that's not a serious offence and I don't have to report, but that's a whole different story. You're the lawyer in the room. But there's no incentive for anyone to report it. I've always wondered why or how we can incentivise if the first victim reports. There's always going to be victimisation, right? This isn't about eliminating victimisation. It's about reducing the harm and the volume that we're seeing. So to your point, if you collected the indicators of compromise, what was the command and control infrastructure, the way they communicate, that's stuff you can actually take action around.
100%.
And so what you're sort of talking about here is the equivalent of a notifiable data breach, but a sort of a notifiable ransom event type legislation, something as well worded as that, where you can do it. We're not stopping you, but it should be clearly a path of last resort that you're actually paying. But you give us that information.
The IST report has an additional recommendation saying that companies should be required to consider alternatives before they make a payment.
Yes.
Well, one of the, I think, fairly disturbing things about the Colonial Pipeline incident is, everyone outside of InfoSec is, being exposed to this issue for the first time is horrified, saying they paid $5 million to a Russian crime group. Like Sean Hannity's section on Fox News on this was really something to behold. Like the incredulity of a talking head on TV about that proposition, I think is a good reminder to people in InfoSec who've become used to this that actually that's crazy. But the thing that disturbed me the most about that incident in looking at the TikTok is they paid that ransom very quickly. Like I think on the day of the incident, while their spokesmen were telling journalists on background that they weren't going to pay. Now it's clear that their internal decision making wasn't lined up on that they both moved very quickly on reaching a conclusion while their corporate affairs or their media team were spinning something else. So I don't think they went through a rigorous process. Now look, it's really easy for me from the outside, like I'm not a critical infrastructure owner facing an outage in the same way as they are.
45% of the liquid fuels to the east coast of the US. But
you can imagine the pressure.
You raise an interesting point about how quickly they caved, how they spoke a different language to what they seemed to be doing, and I think it'd be a really interesting case. And you're right. It's probably the first time for a lot of Americans and probably many people around the world that they've actually seen the sort of really visceral impact that such a crime can have.
I think to use the phrase that one of my political rivals has used in the past, I think this was the barbecue stopper of cybersecurity incidents in the US. This is something that cut through.
So it's a bit like, and I hate to raise it, but hashtag census fail. We're coming up to 5 years from the census.
It's not too soon, surely.
August 2016. May this next one be a good, calm, well-executed census. But it was the first time that the public started to understand the concept of a distributed denial of service. Not something the average punter talks about, but they actually saw some of the world's smallest denial of service attacks actually take down a website that had an impact upon people in households. What benefit do you think, in a weird way, these incidents have for driving that public discourse and getting the public to start asking for solutions?
Look, awareness raising it's a cudgel that is constantly beaten in this space. But I do think that these incidents, particularly when they happen in the political sphere, are sort of slowly but surely raising the awareness level of political actors in this space.
Do you think they're more mature? Do you think the political class is better able to talk about cybersecurity than it was, say, April 2016 when Mr. Turnbull launched the first cybersecurity strategy?
Are they at the level they need to be? No. Are they a lot more mature than the past? Absolutely. I mean, that's definitely the case. I should say that I'm a little bit concerned about some of the kind of interventions from politicians seeing this for the first time. This is a really complex space and the trade-offs are real. And you see in the wake of the Colonial Pipeline attack and actually more so with the SolarWinds incident, like there are a lot of politicians out there saying this is an act of war, right? Well, SolarWinds, I don't think on any kind of norm of of appropriate state behaviour could be considered an act of war.
It was spying?
It's espionage, right? So I think as more politicians become aware of these issues and start engaging with them, the free advice that I would give to colleagues across the spectrum is tread carefully. You want your words to mean something in this space. And if you're saying something's an act of war, you better appreciate the consequences
of calling it
that.
a war. So you spend a large part of your day not just serving the people of Gellibrand, but obviously dealing with cybersecurity matters.
I love it.
Should you? Well, and you can tell, by the way, which is great. Should you have a counterpart in the government benches? It's you and I think, agree on this.
Well, it's.
I'd be shocked if you said no.
It's been fairly lonely the last couple of years, Elmac. I mean, we came to a view after the 2019 election that actually mirrors the view of the 2016 cybersecurity strategy, that there needs to be someone in government that this is their day job, that they can spend their time getting across these complexities, the trade-offs, getting their head around the technical nature of this portfolio. But not only that, but actually going out beyond the intelligence community, beyond the security silos within government, and turning up in boardrooms, talking to companies that are trying to lift their cyber resilience and hearing what they are confronting and bring that back into government, a bridging role. So I'm heartened to see in recent times that it seems like Andrew Hastie, the Shadow Assistant Minister for Defence, has been given responsibility for the ACSC. So it seems like they're trying to carve out a bit of a role for him in that space. And also, it's a good thing that Karen Andrews is saying she wants to lift the priority of cybersecurity in the Home Affairs portfolio. So I'm happy to be heartened by those developments. But I'd say to Andrew, who I have good regard for, and we agree on a lot of things, and we've worked together on things in the past, get out of government, get out of the security silos, get out of the defence community, and go meet with boards, go meet with the corporate sector, because that's the best value add that he can have in his role.
I was going to say that the counter to actually having a cyber security minister or different names is it's a vector, and we should be looking at the effects. I don't necessarily agree with the argument, but there you go. I've wrecked my own question. But what do you think of that?
I mean, the one thing that we really need in this space, and again, I think the 2016 strategy nailed this, is leadership from government. Lifting the profile of the issue as well, but also having the hard conversations inside and outside of government. So for example, like in my role, I don't technically have any responsibility over the PSPF and the security posture of Commonwealth entities. But I spend a lot of time on that issue through the Public Accounts and Audit Committee in Parliament, because I think it's an issue where there are ongoing problems and we need an uplift. And I view that as a leadership role that I can play, given the cybersecurity title in my role, even though I don't have formal responsibility for it, because I have a bit of an understanding and insight, and I can have a discussion about the top 4 and the Essential 8 and mitigating controls, and I can get my head around that, I can contribute. I think that's what you need. You need political actors that have traction on these issues, an understanding of them, and an ability to push into them.
And then test. So I should just say that if you've got questions out in the internet, feel free to send them in. We'll ask some probably in about 5 or so minutes. We'll see what the internet has to say to us. You've just taken me down the path I was hoping we'd get to. There was a recent US presidential direction that came out. It was pre-Colonial Pipeline, and my understanding was in the making before SolarWinds or certainly around that time. But there's some quite specific recommendations for how government procures and the way in which the government and private sector needs to operate. I might unpick a few of those with you and get your view, since you mentioned things like the Essential 8 and the Top 4 and all those things. So one of the components of that presidential direction says suppliers, I'm paraphrasing, must report essentially on their prevention, detection, response, and investigation, and what they're doing to protect themselves as they're procured, as they're procured by the federal government, and that's a supply chain question.
Yep.
Do we need something similar in Australia?
Yes.
Okay, that's a long answer. Any other?
There are aspects of the current structure that go to that. So the primes have a cybersecurity standard that they require for. The defence primes, the big contractors, have been rolling out a standard in the defence supply chain, right? Yep. Obviously, it's a far broader issue than that.
Yeah. So this one really, what I like about what the president's done here is he's using the buying power of the federal government, which we've also got a significant buying power in our federal government, to push the suppliers to change the way they act. So it includes things like keeping network and system logs, so that if the federal government needs them, it seems like a no-brainer, right? It seems revolutionary, but the number of incidents we go into, and we go into a lot of incidents where they're just not kept by people. If you've got that sort of supply, if you're procuring, then you can start forcing those who are supplying to you, whether it's an outsourced IT company or some other company, to keep those logs. That's better for all of us. It goes to some of that point you were making before about just give us the information at least, even if the bad event occurs. They also talk about changing the NIST standards and guidance towards zero trust and moving faster to secure cloud and all the as a service things. Your view on that?
I mean, I think that's really interesting, but it'd be difficult to implement in the current structure in Australia. So in Australia, we have every Commonwealth entity has to comply with the PSPF, and the information security manual is a part of that, right? But the mandatory requirements are very minimal. I mean, I know everyone is always concerned about going down a compliance pathway in this space for good reason, but they're really the only compliance mandatory obligation in the Commonwealth is the Top 4. Beyond that, entities are asked to assess for themselves what other controls that they need based on their threat environment and what they're facing. So it's a very devolved structure. It puts a lot of obligation on the secretaries or the directors of all of these entities, some of which are very, very small, don't have a lot of maturity at all. Now we're moving away from that to
the cyber hubs.
To the hubs, right?
Could you tell me what your view is there?
Well, I think the hubs is a great idea, and it will uplift on capability. If you have a big Commonwealth entity, sort of being a big brother, helping out the smaller ones, giving them advice, maybe you could partner up on some procurement stuff as well. I think that'd be a good thing to see. That's great. That'll uplift capability. What it won't change is accountability, right? I think the failure in the system at the moment is that there's no one responsible for either what the resilience and the maturity level is, or if something went wrong for a breach. Theoretically, in the system, department secretaries are responsible for that, right? Mm-hmm. But they're not. There's no consequences for failure to comply. I mean, 8 years after the Top 4 was made mandatory, the Auditor General inquires into this every year, and we are somewhere between a quarter and a third of entities compliant with the Top 4 as a baseline, right? No one's ever held responsible for that. And then when I, as a parliamentarian, seek to hold people responsible for it.
What should the consequences be?
Well, it's difficult, right? Because it'd be unfair to hold a secretary responsible if the problem is a lack of investment. If they don't have access to the resources to make themselves compliant, something like application whitelisting might be complicated depending on the structure. It might require additional investment. If they make a application for additional funds to do that and it's knocked back, you can't really blame the secretary, right? Like, I'm old-fashioned. I think the accountability point here needs to be the minister, right? They're the ones that's sitting at the top of that hierarchy. But when I, as a member of Parliament, I through Senate estimates, asked literally every Commonwealth entity, are you top 4 compliant? And got back a standard response saying, well, we couldn't possibly tell you because that would create a threat map for actors.
Do you think the threat actors worked it out themselves already?
Well, honestly, I think if Senate estimates questions are affecting your threat model, some of these organisations should know that they are a target anyway. But to test that, the next round of estimates, I put in a set of questions saying, hey, are you DMARC compliant?
Yep.
I got the same set of answers back saying, oh, we couldn't possibly tell you that because that'd create a roadmap for actors. Like, DMARC is externally observable.
Yep.
So there's this kind of culture of rejecting parliamentary accountability here that I think we really do need to change.
So we're going to get down that rabbit hole, get your questions ready, and I'm just speaking to the tech crew here. Feel free to throw one up on the screen at some point. But I'm just going to get to that last question because I think it's a really fascinating one. Having sat in front of Senate estimates and appeared before various committees, we'll get to that question in 2 seconds. What would you do then to drive that accountability back to the Parliament?
So I should say that I don't dismiss out of hand the idea that we don't have responsibilities about making public security vulnerabilities. Like, I get that you could create a worsening threat environment by doing that. I think we have it within our capability to develop different accountability models in the Parliament. So there's the Defence Major Projects review that the Auditor General conducts with the Public Accounts and Audit Committee. Some of that is in camera because it is sensitive. I think if you set up a mechanism that allowed Public Accounts and Audit, which has a long history of bipartisan accountability, it's a serious committee that's institutionally does its job in holding people accountable. Let the Auditor General and let ASD speak to it. I think you could drive behaviour change there. But we do need to change this. We need someone's head on the block ultimately if they're rejecting the advice coming through there.
All right. Interesting points. Question here from the internet, which is always a bit scary. Let's see what the Lucky Dip says. Where do you see our largest cyber risk coming from? Who are the threat actors?
So I suppose the biggest day-to-day risk is this growing ransomware issue, and that's confirmed by the ACSC. They've said it's the biggest cyber threat confronting Australia at the moment. I suppose the one thing that I would say in that context, though, is that at least with ransomware, you see entities who have a understanding that this is a threat, and they have the tools to go about addressing it. One of the issues that I've been trying to get more attention to, we talk a lot about the potential for cyber-enabled foreign interference. So that is nation states using, it might be hack and leak campaigns, it might be hack and extort campaigns, it might be surveillance and espionage of people in Australia. I think there's a gap in our institutional arrangements for protecting vulnerable groups in that respect, for helping them lift their cyber resilience. We focus a lot on protecting government and people like me from foreign interference, but I think we really need to be looking at, we know diaspora groups, we know the think tanks, we know the media groups, particularly media groups in diaspora communities, that are big targets of this kind of cyber-enabled foreign state interference. We know who we're talking about here.
Yep.
Facebook rumbled a big campaign on that recently. I asked a series of questions in Senate estimates like, whose job is it to help prospectively protect these groups? There's nothing there at the moment.
And if you asked it more broadly, where in the bureaucracy, who in the bureaucracy should be protecting, because it gets really muddy, right?
Yep.
Disinformation. Who should stop a lie? Because in our democracy, if you, well, maybe not you in your role, but let's say I was just a punter on the street, I could say anything I want about politics. But that's kind of like an Australian's role to screw up our parliament. If a nation state does it, is it an intelligence agency that starts choosing what's truthful and what's not? Because to the average Australian, as much as they want to protect their democracy, they'd be really loath to have an intelligence agency doing it. If not them, then who? The cops?
Absolutely.
Do they trust them to do it?
So, so in the US, they do have an institutional structure for this, and CISA took that responsibility under Chris Krebs. They really sort of grabbed it and moved forward with it. In Australia, it's a bit of a grab bag. So the ACMA has a disinformation code that they have got the social media platforms to sign up to. That we haven't seen that in practice yet. But the thing that really disturbs me in this space is not wrong information. It's the coordinated and targeted abuse of Australians speaking on specific issues on social media. I mean, you look at the way that Vicky Xu has been treated online for her work on Xinjiang at ASPI. You go through her mentions, and that is a coordinated campaign of the most vile intimidation that you can imagine. But when we look at our institutional arrangements for
to protect her,
protecting or supporting her for exercising her rights as a participant in the Australian political debate, there's no one whose responsibility that is.
And we would or should argue too, I think, that the platforms, and I think you've said this earlier, the platforms should also be doing something about it. And how are they not?
Well, the platforms, they have made significant gains in responding to coordinated inauthentic behaviour.
Yes.
So, that's
not willingly.
Not willingly. I mean, it only took some pretty significant US presidential interference before they realised we do have a responsibility to the democratic process here. But, the Facebook reports on coordinated inauthentic behaviour campaigns, I think, are really useful. They provide really important transparency, and they make it unambiguous that this is a big issue, and it's not just a Russia-US issue. This is happening everywhere. You get small private sector groups running it out of, well, I don't want to go into naming nations, but like small nations against small nations, like literally every day of the week. But yeah, like we have an obligation as an Australian government to protect the democratic process in Australia.
I often say it's our most critical piece of infrastructure, are our parliaments.
And
they're not named in the SOCI Act.
That's right. I mean,
should they be?
Look, you can't have a cookie cutter approach. You can't say that a small diaspora group's email server or a think tank can have the same kind of obligations as in that SOCI Act, right? Because they're just not able to.
Should we, though, name our democracy as a piece of critical infrastructure, as amorphous as that is?
Yeah, so the weird thing is that it is a piece of critical infrastructure on the Act if it's within government. So the AEC is considered critical infrastructure, but everything else around the election is not, right?
So, including hate speech and other things online.
Well, and including coordinated foreign interference. So it's now very common. I mean, it's almost the norm in elections since 2016 to have foreign nations trying to interfere in democratic processes through hack and leak campaigns. So you take the last UK election, Jeremy Fox, the trade minister, one of his staff's Gmail accounts was hacked. Through that, they got to a series of trade negotiation papers between the UK and the US. That was then given to Jeremy Corbyn and the Labor Party. And that was where all of that, they're going to privatise the NHS type stuff came from. It's a Russian campaign. Now, under the current definitions on SOCI, because that vector was through a Gmail account,
it's not a...
It's off the grid, right?
Yep.
And as an MP, I feel that really acutely because, I run CRMs, I run all kinds of social media services, previously run email servers. But none of that's protected unless it's on the APH account, network. None of that's protected by our institutional infrastructure. So yeah, I think while just designating them as critical infrastructure, it's just you can't have that one size fits all type approach. What I think we absolutely need is proactive frameworks, information sharing. You might do vulnerability assessments, like automated assessments, pushing out into these groups, awareness raising. Something that looks a bit like the kind of the ISACs in the US, a prospective uplift type structure as part of this critical infrastructure.
Drive cost into the operator, not the legitimate operator. I'm doing a very poor job of getting through questions from the internet because I keep asking you sub-questions. Oh, we've just lost it. Yeah. There we go. Can you outline the scope of the proposed critical infrastructure changes and the levels of responsibilities?
This feels like a university test.
Yeah, well, good luck, because I have them written down somewhere.
It's enormous. It's very significant.
Do you like it? Are you supportive?
I mean, look, it's in front of PJCS at the moment, so it's subject to inquiry. I think if you were doing a desktop exercise about the kind of regulatory structure you needed to address these threats, and address threats like Colonial Pipeline, this is a good kind of a structure, right? But as you know better than anyone probably, actually building resilience inside private owners of critical infrastructure is not a desktop exercise.
No.
You know, the real challenge behind this legislation is what's going to happen over the next 5 years as we try to lift maturity levels across verticals that cover maybe 60% of the ASX 200. Like, we are going to be going into some verticals that forget about compliance with cybersecurity requirements. Like, some of these have pretty dodgy OH&S compliance structures built into them. Like they're starting from a very low level. So for me, while sure, the legislation it seems like a good desktop a starting point, but really, what is the government doing to lift resilience throughout in the real world in the wake of it?
So I'm going to ask one more question. We're going to have to make it a speed dating question, or else I'm going to get in trouble. We grew up. Oh no, I've lost it. I've lost my screen. There we go. We grew up learning about locking doors, locking our cars or bikes when we leave them unattended. Do we need more education for internet users and small businesses? Okay, I'm just going to ask it this way. How do we protect small businesses? Because we're talking about the big end of town here. What about the 3 million plus small businesses in this country? Can we ever protect them? And if so, how? I'll give you a minute because it's such an easy question to answer.
Look, I can say the current approach isn't working. Putting PDFs on a central government website saying here are the things you need to do as a small business just doesn't cut it. There's like 2.3 million small businesses in Australia. I got the answers from Senate estimates about how many times the Small Business Essentials page had been downloaded.
How many?
It's in the tens of thousands.
Right.
So we're not reaching everyone. I think the better approach is to use intermediaries, so trusted advisors that small business already go to. Maybe their bank manager, which is usually the first place they get cyber training.
Of course, yeah.
2FA is probably the first place they get it from a bank. Industry associations, local chambers of commerce, council business training groups. Those are the kind of places they're used to getting information. Use the intermediaries. That's the way I'd go about it. There is a discussion to be had around what they should be doing and how we can sort of set benchmarks and standards there. The UK has that Cyber Essentials program for small business, like a stripped back top 4 targeted specifically for small business. Maybe that's something else we should be looking at in Australia.
Great. Hey, look, thanks, Tim. Clearly, I could have spoken for hours with you. You're encyclopedic and really deep knowledge of these issues. I really appreciate it. I'm sure our audience did too, so perhaps we can get you back at some later stage.
I would be delighted.
Thanks again for everyone watching. Thanks for accepting the odd technical glitch and a really crappy introduction on the part of me and some weird long-winded questions. Just like to thank you again, Tim, for your time. It's great.
My pleasure.